On August 25th, 2018, Leonard Bernstein would have reached his 100th birthday, so just next month he would have been 100 years old. For those of us who remember watching the Young People's concerts on TV, or buying cast albums of the first Broadway productions of West Side Story and Candide, it doesn't seem possible, it didn't to me, that the creator of those works came from a century-old era. Bernstein's works remain vital, young, and fresh. Now there's a book with a fresh and, I wasn't supposed to hold that up, but there it is, with a fresh and vital slant on the day-to-day life of Leonard Bernstein. His penultimate personal assistant, Charlie Harmon, is here to read from his book, On the Road and Off the Road with Leonard Bernstein. Charlie will also explain his book's subtitle, My Years with the Exasperating Genius. After his presentation, Charlie will be available, it says here in the tent behind the History Center, ignore that, right up here to sign the book and answer some additional questions. Charlie saw Leonard Bernstein nearly every day for 4 years, from 1982 through 1985, which is the scope of this memoir. Fortunately, in those days before personal computers, Charlie kept a handwritten date book so the details of the memoir are accurate and overwhelming, as the job of being the personal assistant to the maestro. As music director for the estate of Leonard Bernstein, Charlie was responsible for the first publication of a few Bernstein works, the full scores of West Side Story and Candide, for starters. But his memoir is his first book in words. Please welcome Charlie Harmon.
If you can't hear me at any point, just shout, please. And I'm really happy to be in Vermont again, first time since 1977, when I was living in Boston, and I spent my summer vacation, first year I was there, bicycling to Montreal and back. And that's what a young, stupid person does for a vacation. This is much easier. And I do want to thank the History Center and the Norman Williams Public Library and the Yankee Bookshop, and Jenny, Pam, and Jeff. I have to say that a public library and a bookshop are central to the legacy of Leonard Bernstein. He was determined to foster as much curiosity in the public as he could, and he thought libraries were just the biggest playgrounds ever devised. And I have to agree with him. And when I had finished creating his archive, when was that? In the late 1980s, his secretary had saved everything under the sun, but she didn't know what it was. I went through it with an insurance appraiser and created an archive, and I was absolutely thrilled when the Library of Congress lobbied to take this collection. So everything is there in the Library of Congress. Almost all the letters and photos and music manuscripts have been scanned. You can look at them online. They don't reproduce very well, and that's on purpose, but you can use them for research purposes, and it's just available for all, which was the intent. And it's a huge collection. So everybody always asks me, how did I meet Leonard Bernstein? Well, I was living in New York. I didn't have much ambition, but I had lived in Germany and Italy when I was younger because my father was in the army, and I had experience with training with languages. I'd taken piano lessons. I had a degree from Carnegie Mellon in music composition, but to earn a living, I took computer courses, and that's what I was doing in Boston. Because I'm sorry, a music degree. My parents were right. They wanted me to be an architect. Anyway, and there was an ad in the New York Times that was under M for musician. And when you buy the book and read the first chapter, you'll learn about my interview, which just floored me, Didn't say anything, the ad didn't say anything about Leonard Bernstein. So I was hired, but I turned the job down because the schedule for the first year that I would have worked, 1982, was just crazy. It was an impossible schedule. And I couldn't imagine a 64-year-old man doing it, much less me. I was a low energy person back then, even though I had bicycled to Montreal. I was 31 and I said, no, thank you. And then the Bernstein's manager called me up again and said, okay, you can have the job on a trial basis. You have to fly to Bloomington, Indiana this Friday. This is the first week of January, 1982, and you'll be there for 6 weeks. And I said, I'll come to your office and we'll talk about it. All right, so here I am in Bloomington, Indiana. I had lived twice in Fort Knox, Kentucky, so I knew what that part of the country was like in the wintertime. I wasn't happy to be there. There was this lakeside condo that was donated to the School of Music to house visiting celebrities. So here we were at the lakeside condo. I had no idea how to make myself useful. Should I ask when Mr. Bernstein would show up? I hadn't even met him yet. Why hadn't Harry or Anne, who was the cook, Harry was Bernstein's manager, said anything about the maestro's arrival? In the upstairs bedroom, Harry fingered the thin draperies drawn across the wall of windows overlooking Lake Monroe. Attend to these right away. Lenny requires his bedroom to be pitch black, Harry said. Find some black plastic bags and pin them to the outside of the drapes. Oh, that's simple enough. Then Harry collected Anne with her 3-foot-long shopping list, because we were going to be there for 6 weeks, and drove off to the biggest supermarket in town. How much time did I have? I found a box of heavy black plastic bags and some straight pins, and I slit one bag open to make a large sheet. And I stood very unsteadily on a stool. I held the plastic against the drapes and stuck the pins in. 2 hours passed. I'd blacked out only a third of the drapes when Anne dashed back into the bedroom and urged me to unpack the luggage right away. Then she ran back downstairs to make dinner. Each suitcase approximated an armoire, but all of them were nearly empty. There were a few black socks, scandalously flimsy underpants, some sport shirts, a couple pair of tailored jeans, 2 blazers, no flannel, no thermal cotton, no woolens. The housekeeper in New York had packed Mr. Bernstein's clothes, but evidently no one had told her about winter in Indiana. She was from Chile. I had no idea how Mr. Bernstein organized his things, so I had to guess. I filled the drawers of a tall dresser with upper body clothes at the top, socks at the bottom. As I stashed the last empty suitcase into a utility closet, the front door opened downstairs, and a boisterous crowd of people burst into the condo. Anne certainly knew about timing. I could hear Charles Webb, that's the dean of the School of Music, the most powerful man in the music business at that time, with his wife Kinda coming through the door. As I descended the stairs, Harry Kraut, Bernstein's manager, entered the foyer and introduced me to Stephen Wadsworth, Bernstein's librettist for the new opera, which is why Bernstein was there in Indiana to begin writing an opera, and Richard Nelson, a film and television actor, serving as Bernstein's interim assistant. A few other university people spilled out of a sizable van in the driveway, and then there was the maestro. A cocktail party, already in progress, inched through the door, the noise at peak volume as though somebody had just delivered one hilarious punchline. Over the hubbub, Harry said the van's stock of scotch had flowed freely on the short ride from the Bloomington airport. Lenny raved about the van's cup holders because they lit up, Harry said. You put your drink down, it lights up. From my spot at the foot of the stairs, I took in this diminutive, decidedly derelict, geriatric, cocooned in an enormous white parka. Mr. Bernstein made an inordinate amount of noise. "It's the pelt of a real wolf," he said several times, indicating the lining of his parka. Good. One piece of winter clothing, I thought. All his energy was going into his jabbering and joking, so he barely moved into the foyer, forcing the crowd behind him into a semicircle. He looked like a priestly leader shepherding a worshipful flock. The procession shuffled to a standstill, but remained on high volume. Despite the deep tan on his face, Mr. Bernstein looked terrible, shriveled and wizened and wildly unkempt. He looked like he hadn't slept in ages, nor had he shaved or showered that day. He reeked of rancid suntan lotion, strong cologne, and a damp dog rankness that wafted from his parka's wolf fur. I had discreetly poured myself a tablespoon of gin to steady my nerves, but I hadn't taken a sip. After Harry Kraut said my name, which was all the introduction I was going to get, I took the wolf off Mr. Bernstein's shoulders and asked him if he'd like a drink. "What are you drinking?" he asked. I picked up the small glass of gin. He grabbed it out of my hand and drained it in one swig. "That's my drink," I said. Mr. Bernstein tilted his head back and roared like a wild beast. "You don't talk that way to the Rebbe!" My mouth fell open. He's a rabbi? I'd never heard anyone refer to himself as a rabbi while snatching a glass of gin. In the brief pause, I saw not a biblical scholar, but a weary and pretty drunk elderly man, genuinely angry, ready to toss me out of my ear into the snowy fields of Indiana. Everybody else stood around grinning. Somebody suggested a scotch on the rocks, so I poured a little Ballantines on ice and handed it to Mr. Bernstein, who then swept into the condo for an inspection. I had no idea what was going on. Was I already out of a job? Had I been rude? I stood by with the rest of the flock and watched the maestro rabbi as he talked first to one university official and then another. When Mr. Bernstein spoke to anybody, he placed one hand on the listener's shoulder, and he was pretty short, oddly reminding me of a dog steadying itself on its hind legs. As Mr. Bernstein gazed directly into his listener's eyes, he gave the impression that he was devoting his exclusive, utterly rapt attention. Then Mr. Bernstein asked to see his bedroom, so I led him upstairs. Everybody else stayed below. Now I could find out if this room met his needs and what he expected of me. He'd spend 6 weeks in that room, so it had to be a place away from all cares except the as yet unwritten opera, which, if I still had a job, it might be my duty to see through to completion. I pointed to the plastic bags I had pinned to the drapes. "I'll finish this later," I said. "Don't bother," he said kindly. "I always wear a sleep mask." I almost followed up with, but Harry said, and Mr. Bernstein continued, "I have this white noise machine," as he pulled a squat kind of bowl-shaped appliance out of his carry-on bag. "See, it has 2 settings, but I always set it on high, and it covers up any outside noise." A sleep mask? A white noise machine? So I could drop this pin on the plastic bag project, thank goodness. I surmised that Harry's instructions might not always align with the maestro's reality. I showed him the dresser drawers. He laughed and rearranged the contents to match his dresser at home. Top drawer, handkerchiefs on one side, socks on the other. His jovial tone told me that the roaring Rebbe of 15 minutes earlier might have been an act, now abandoned. I hadn't unpacked the book bags yet. He offered to go through them with me. Chambers' English Dictionary, the standard for aficionados of the cryptic anagrams and British crossword puzzles, went on the shelf most easily reached from the bed. Dictionaries in Italian, German, and Spanish, a single-volume edition of the complete works of Lewis Carroll, the Oxford compilation of English verse, and several fiction and nonfiction works currently in print. These had to be within an arm's length of the bed. There was also a small Hebrew Bible, as I would have called it then, because I wasn't sure it was the Torah, bound in silver and studded with semi-precious stones. "This travels with me everywhere," he said. At sunset every Friday, I phoned my mother. This is an inviolable rule. It didn't matter what else was in his schedule or where in the world he was. One Friday, he called his mother after visiting Tchaikovsky's grave. She responded with memories of her Russian childhood. Bernstein said he didn't celebrate Shabbat, but this particular weekly observance was sacred to him. Then he showed me how to unpack a hefty leather valise, about the size of this podium, that he'd taken on the flights that day. This is the medicine bag, he said. It contained everything under the sun: an electric toothbrush, Tums and other antacids, toothpaste, hair gel, combs, collar stays, scissors, an expensive electric razor, 3 big bottles of cologne, more Tums, more hair gel, aqua filters. They're little plastic cigarette holders. They each contain a water-saturated sponge, safety pins, dental floss, buttons, a sewing kit, more aqua filters, yet more Tums, and prescription canisters of pills he said helped him to sleep, to wake up, get over indigestion and diarrhea, and just about any other conceivable ailment. I had never seen bronchotabs before. Those dilated his lungs. I'd never seen inhalers either. There were several, yellow and blue, for Mr. Bernstein's periodic bouts with emphysema. I could scarcely make sense of this medicine bag mishmash. A small compartment in the bag held collar stays and safety pins mixed up with assorted cufflinks, including a pair shaped like miniature tennis rackets. Stephen Sondheim gave me these, he said, handling them delicately. All about playing games, I thought. He showed me a pair of elegant lion head cufflinks with tiny diamond eyes that were a gift from President Jimmy Carter. Then Mr. Bernstein held up a pair of gold squares. Kusi gave me these, he said. I knew he meant Dr. Serge Koussevitzky, music director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and founder of Tanglewood, the orchestra's summer home. They were his, and I wear them for every concert, Bernstein said. If my shirt doesn't have French cuffs, I carry them in my pocket. I took a breath. Here's Mr. Bernstein standing next to me, telling me that before he walked onto a stage, he brought each cufflink up to his lips for an affectionate ritual kiss. These small golden squares were more than a talisman. They represented a first-hand connection to the ancient and exalted history of serious music. As we stood in front of this disorganized valise, I made a mental note to find a pillbox so I could carry the Koussevitzky cufflinks in my pocket, rather than risk losing them in the medicine bag's unholy mess. I was taking stock of things I could improve. Looking back now on what I saw in that valise that afternoon, I realized how Mr. Bernstein's complex life was reflected right there in that chaos. So when we get back to New York in February, after 6 weeks in lovely Bloomington, I agree to tackle the job, even though the schedule for the year is absurd. After a few weeks in March, we go down to the National Symphony for 2 weeks of Bernstein conducting concerts. So that was the first time I had ever seen him as a conductor. I'd never been to one of his concerts before working for him. He made time in his schedule almost every year to conduct the National Symphony. It was just important to him because it was part of the Kennedy Center and because it's the National Symphony. I had been to Washington many times, but not on this level. So I'll read this chapter, and then I think that will be it, and then I'll do some questions if you have a few brief questions, or you may just have to ask me questions if you want a book signed. The 2 weeks in Washington in March 1982 resembled a left-wing variety show. Politicians, members of the press stepped into LB's schedule like actors in and out of the limelight. First up, the journalist and civil rights activist Roger Wilkins, whose autobiography, A Man's Life, was published that year, 10 years after he'd shared the Washington Post Pulitzer Prize for exposing the Nixon Watergate scandal. The same newspaper's music critic, Paul Hume, invited LB to his home for off-the-record discussions about contemporary music and overly ambitious music critics. LB griped about every music critic in the New York Times, underlining every equivocation with a pen. His point was that pompous critics pad their columns. Adrienne Barth, the widow of the author and Washington Post editor Alan Barth, invited L.B. for dinner at her home, as did Roger and Christine Stevens. L.B.'s friendship with Mr. Stevens extended over several decades. Mr. Stevens had helped produce West Side Story on Broadway in 1957. He commissioned Mass for the opening of the Kennedy Center in 1971, and Mr. Stevens continued to serve into the 1980s as chairman of the Kennedy Center's board. Most of the time, I was invited too, and if I sat in the limo's back seat, I'd ask L.B. about these people and their politics. Given his steep political slant to the far, far left, L.B.'s optimistic long view often turned to frustration in the short term. My views were similar, though I'd put political participation aside since leaving college, when I had trekked door to door for Eugene McCarthy in 1968 and for George McGovern in 1972. You can see why I was disillusioned. Fervent and idealistic back then, now I had questions. Was the Democratic Party splintering? What was happening in the South? What about politics and the arts? I could learn plenty from Bernstein's articulate friends. Shortly before St. Patrick's Day, Ethel Kennedy's secretary called to invite L.B. for dinner on March 17th, the Saint's Day itself. As I relayed the invitation to L.B., I asked if I could come along. After so many high-level meals in Washington, I thought I might be up to mingling with the Kennedys. And when would I have another opportunity? L.B. surprised me. Of course, he said. I was never sure of my status as part of his staff. Sometimes he also suggested a free evening would do me a lot of good. The grand white columns fronting the house at Hickory Hill gave me a twinge of nerves. Was I ready for this level of aristocracy? L.B. had other concerns. In the driveway, he grabbed my arm and cried out, "If Teddy's here," that's Senator Edward Kennedy, for those of you who are too young, "please don't let me say anything about Chappaquiddick." In 1969, Senator Kennedy had driven off a bridge on Martha's Vineyard, drowning his car's passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, a scandal that ended his presidential hopes forever. That much I knew. But how could I stop L.B., we called him L.B. as he called himself, from putting his foot in his mouth? Maybe it helped him to panic out loud, what a shrink might call acting out. From the hallway into the dining room, Bernstein spied the journalist Diane Sawyer, dazzlingly blonde, seated at Senator Ted Kennedy's left. "I knew it. There's a blonde right next to him," he said, in a stage whisper, grabbing my arm again. I'd forgotten, frankly, that Mary Jo Kopechne had been blonde. As Bernstein panicked, I only half listened, my eyes on the wall behind his head, scanning a framed letter signed by Thomas Jefferson. Oh my, I thought, this place is the real deal. Senator Robert F. Kennedy acquired that letter and put it there on that very wall. A thinking, problem-solving, compassionate man whose tenure would have been as noble and erudite as Jefferson's. If only. I felt flooded with warmth, as if an unseen hand extended a welcome into a world more high-minded, optimistic, and gracious than any I had ever imagined. L.B. made such a ruckus in the hallway that Ethel Kennedy came in to see what the matter was. L.B. shifted gears and said he didn't know it was going to be such a formal event. All the men, including me, were in suits. L.B. had thrown on an old fisherman knit sweater, because it was Irish, and he felt underdressed. Mrs. Kennedy said, "Come on, Lenny, it doesn't matter, it's just us." She pulled him into the dining room as though she were used to shoving her guests around. "Now sit down and join the party." Two large round tables took up the entire dining room, one table headed by Senator Ted Kennedy, the other by his sister-in-law Ethel. I recognized a couple of senators at each table. L.B. was seated at Mrs. Kennedy's table, and I was shown a seat between Diane Sawyer and a venerable Kennedy family friend, Dorothy Tubridy. To her left was Senator Mark Hatfield, a Republican from Oregon, the state where I was born. Diane Sawyer took up Senator Kennedy's attention, so I turned to Mrs. Tubridy, who twinkled with grace, lightly dusted over a pretty earthy Irish humor. Her theatrical Irish accent and low-pitched laugh delighted me no end as she shared her sharp insights on the Kennedys, their glamour, their fierce competitiveness. Now and then I leaned across to speak with Senator Hatfield, whose political career I had followed a long time. So this was dinner in Washington, I thought. Gossip and politics, nothing I couldn't handle. Suddenly, Ethel Kennedy ran around the room, ringing a spoon in a glass like a little bell, announcing the first round of a competition. Uh-oh. I'd read somewhere how mortifying these contests could be. At a dinner honoring Robert Frost, she had challenged everybody to write a poem, as if tossing off Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening was child's play. Tonight's competition was tied to St. Patrick's Day, 10 points to the table producing the best Irish song. Senator Kennedy, who was a very persuasive man, leaned toward me and suggested that as a musician, I could probably sing. But did I know any Irish songs? This was an expectation of a high order. I knew that I should go first, or I'd never have the nerve to say anything the rest of the evening. Mrs. Tubridy kindly whispered that it really didn't matter if my song was Irish or not. Nobody there would know the difference, except her. I stood and announced, sorry to say, I'm not a singer, so I will recite a poem that is like a song, A Coat by William Butler Yeats. As a student composer, I'd struggled through 5 attempts to set these words to music, in the process firmly embedding them in my memory. I made my song a coat covered with embroideries out of old mythologies from heel to throat. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. At the applause and appreciative laughter, I smiled and looked around, glancing at Bernstein, who sat open-mouthed in astonishment. Was I his first assistant who could recite a poem off the top of his head? I thought I'd earned more than 10 points. The Kennedy competitiveness was contagious. LB immediately rose and ostentatiously cleared his throat. I shall recite a poem by John Keats, whose name some people pronounce Cates to rhyme with Yates, which some people mistakenly pronounce Yeats. He said to general giggles. I dedicate this poem to our hostess this evening, he said, waving his wine glass toward Mrs. Kennedy. Then he recited the sonnet, Bright Star, in a steady, carefully calibrated voice. He certainly knew how to hold the attention of a room full of people in a quiet and beautifully moving soliloquy. I remembered this moment when I visited the Keats house in Hampstead, north of London, 15 years after Bernstein had died. The manuscript of Bright Star used to be on display there, and as my eyes passed over the handwritten lines, Bernstein's voice sounded in my ear, every carefully enunciated word, his brief pauses, his cultured Bostonian vowels. My tenacious memory for sound summoned up emotions both vivid and soothing, another layer of memory, I thought, tied forever to this verse. Thank you, I said aloud in that room of the Keats house. Ethel Kennedy sprang to her feet and again ran between the tables. 10 extra points for anyone who can define eremite, she said. I knew that slightly archaic word, Keats's characterization of the remote loneliness of his bright star. My hand shot up as though I had the winning bingo card. Hermit, I called out. Hey, this was fun. Was the competition still on? Our table might be winning. Diane Sawyer rose demurely. I don't know anything Irish, she said, but I'll sing something from my family's Scottish heritage. The room quickly hushed, and everyone paid close attention to her voice, which was sweet and low. Irish references were in short supply, so Mrs. Kennedy dragged Bernstein to the piano in the next room. He played a lively ragtime number as some of the men danced a jitterbug, punctuated with Irish heel stomping. Then Bernstein segued into a soulful rendition of Maria from West Side Story. Over the final chord, Mrs. Kennedy commanded, "That was beautiful, but now play a song about Ethel." Ethel, Bernstein said, as if he'd never heard the name before. I'm not sure there is any song about Ethel. By then, most of the politicians had departed, and the youngest Kennedy children came in to say goodnight. LB gave each of them an affectionate hug and soon we were in the car headed back to the Watergate. I thought the evening had been a lot of fun, and Bernstein agreed as he reminisced about visits to the upstairs living room in the Kennedy White House. He made it sound as casual as dropping in on neighbors. One of those evenings, LB said, he sprawled on the floor to watch one of his television broadcasts while Carolyn Kennedy sat quietly behind him, immersed in the music. So he thought. When it was over, she turned to Bernstein and stated flatly, "I have my own pony." And I thought she was absorbed in "what does music mean" or whatever it was, Bernstein chuckled as he retold this in the car. The next day, I asked the Watergate concierge to send Mrs. Kennedy a big bouquet of flowers in her favorite shades of purple with Bernstein's name on the card. Thank you. Jeff, do we have time for a few questions? Okay, anybody have any really embarrassing questions? Yes, please.
So did he ever talk with you about his growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, and what that was like?
Oh, there were some stories. They're beyond the scope of this memoir, unfortunately. Especially his teachers. He fell in love with his teachers. He went to the Hebrew school connected to Mishkan Tefillah, and I met his teacher, Goldie Feinsilver, when she was living in Jerusalem. Well, of course, this was in the 1980s. She was only 18 at the time he was going to that school, so she wasn't much older than he was. And she remembered vividly this, well, he was called Louis back then. His parents had named him Louis, and she remembered this kid named Louis who just took over the class. I mean, he was not obnoxious, but he just always had questions. And from that point on, he adored his teachers. And then there were some family memories, but he didn't talk so much about family. I think the world of education was his escape, but it's also where he knew he could learn things. We didn't talk much about his musical development, except that we both admitted we had never had to learn music. He asked me what early on in my working for him what my music background was, and I told him about my first piano lesson when I was 6 years old. It was in Germany, and the Herr Falke brought this book and put it on the music rack of the piano and said, "This note is middle C. This white note means 2 beats. These black notes mean 1 beat. Middle C is right here, and now we play." And we played a duet. And that was it. So those conversations were really interesting. I make a few references to them because, at least in my memoir, when I refer to myself, then I can bring in some things that Bernstein told me in response. But unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff. Actually, I think there's a number of those stories in Humphrey Burton's biography of Bernstein. He had a wonderful education, a really wonderful education, and that's thanks to Brookline and Boston, because he went to Boston Latin School also. Yes?
Did he have the tendency to review his own performances?
Well, yes, but not publicly. He would ask me sometimes. I didn't get to hear all the performances because usually there was a lot to do backstage, but when I did sit out in the hall, I can remember going backstage afterwards, and he would say, for instance, the Brahms Double Concerto, which I had heard only once before, and this was a performance with the Vienna Philharmonic, let's see, I guess it was in 1982, with Gidon Kramer and Misha Maisky, and I thought it was pretty darn good. And Bernstein asked me if the shape of the piece was okay. Other times, I remember a Rhapsody in Blue in San Francisco. He should not have been trying to play it in public, and he wasn't embarrassed. He was really angry with himself because he couldn't get the notes anymore. He said I guess his left hands just stopped working at one point. There was a guy backstage before he went out, a fan backstage, who said he knew how to give a hand massage. And Bernstein was willing to try anything, and so he got out there. Bernstein went out and tried to perform this, and his left hand just wouldn't work. I mean, whatever the guy did was, we never saw him again either. We never saw the guy who gave the hand massage. And then there were times when he was just so pleased with the way a performance had gone, especially at Tanglewood with the students, for instance. He'd be so happy that they really got it, and that everything came together, and that the audience was, hanging on it, and those were wonderful moments. Yes?
If you know, how much revising did he do when he was composing?
Tons. After the day he died, which is in this book, even though it's beyond the scope of the 4 years I worked for him, I went to see him on what turned out to be the day he died, and he asked me to look after his music. So I became his music editor, which I managed to do for about 8 years. And then I had a different idea of Bernstein's legacy than Bernstein's manager had. I thought the printed music was crucial. And one of the things that Bernstein could not bring himself to do was to write the last page of any piece. And so whenever he would conduct a piece, he would say, I just don't like this ending. I mean, when he conducted his ballet facsimile to record it in Israel with the Israel Philharmonic, he decided to rewrite the last page for that recording. So what do? I mean, you've got this original piece that had been performed for close to 40 years, and now it has a new ending. And yet there were mistakes in the piece that he never corrected. I mean, so what do you do? I think what we ended up doing was just going with the new ending. Same thing with Kaddish, his Third Symphony, when it was up for a reprinting by Boosey and Hawkes, he decided to write the last page. I don't know what the problem was. It just was. I don't know any other composer who had that issue. Yes?
Did he write most of his work because for himself, or was he commissioned?
He did get commissions. The Broadway works were because he or someone else, like Jerome Robbins for West Side Story, had an idea. Jerome Robbins had the idea for Fancy Free, the ballet about three sailors, and Bernstein had these musical ideas, but he didn't know what to do with them. He didn't know it was going to be a ballet until he met Jerome Robbins. And Robbins really liked the music a lot. And what Robbins would do, Bernstein would sit at the piano, he said, and play what he had, and Robbins would stand behind him and press his thumbs into Bernstein's shoulders and say, okay, 8 more bars of that. I don't know if that counts as a collaboration, but it's how some of those things got written. The Ballet Dybbuk, which was another Bernstein-Robbins collaboration. But the concert works were often commissions. Mass, for instance, was a commission from the Kennedy Center. His last opera, A Quiet Place, was commissioned by Houston Grand Opera, the Kennedy Center, and La Scala in Italy. But an awful lot of his music, like Chichester Psalms, he just wrote for himself. He had taken a sabbatical, and he had been conducting, this was when he was at the Philharmonic, he had been conducting a lot of contemporary music. And so he wrote something that doesn't sound contemporary at all, but really, really accessible. And he just wanted to do that for himself. Thank you.